Master word list. Words starting with letter R. Rabid. Means, like a fanatic, furious. For example, he was a rabid follower of the Dodgers and watched them play whenever he could go to the ballpark. Raconteur. Means, storyteller. For example, my father was a gifted raconteur with an unlimited supply of anecdotes. Rail. Means, scold, rant. For example, you may rail at him all you want, you will never change him. Raiment. Means, clothing. For example, how can I go to the ball? Asked Cinderella. I have no raiment fit to wear. Rally. Means, call up or summon, revive. For example, Washington quickly rallied his troops to fight off the British attack. Ramble. Means, wander aimlessly. For example, listening to the teacher ramble, Judy wondered whether he'd ever get to his point. Ramification. Means, branching out, subdivision. For example, we must examine all the ramifications of this problem. Ramify. Means, divide into branches. For example, when the plant begins to ramify, it is advisable to nip off most of the new branches. Ramp. Means, slope, inclined plane. For example, the house was built with ramps instead of stairs in order to enable the man in the wheelchair to move easily from room to room and floor to floor. Rampant. Means, growing in profusion, unrestrained. For example, the rampant weeds in the garden choked the flowers until they died. Ramshackle. Means, rickety, falling apart. For example, the boys propped up the Ramshackle clubhouse with a couple of boards. Rancid. Means, having the odor of stale fat. For example, a rancid odor filled the ship's galley and nauseated the crew. Rancor. Means, bitterness, hatred. For example, 30 years after the war, she could not let go of the past but was still consumed with rancor against the foe. Random. Means, without definite purpose, plan, or aim, haphazard. For example, although the sponsor of the raffle claimed all winners were chosen at random, people had their suspicions when the grand prize went to the sponsor's brother-in-law. Rankle. Means, irritate, fester. For example, the memory of having been jilted rankled him for years. Rant. Means, rave, talk excitedly, scold. For example, when he heard that I'd totaled the family car, Dad began to rant at me like a complete madman. Rapacious. Means, excessively greedy, predatory. For example, the rapacious brigands stripped the villagers of all their possessions. Rapport. Means, emotional closeness, harmony. For example, in team teaching, it is important that all teachers in the group have good rapport with one another. Rapt. Means, absorbed, enchanted. For example, caught up in the wonder of the storyteller's tale, the rapt listeners sat motionless, hanging on his every word. Rarefied. Means, made less dense. For example, the mountain climbers had difficulty breathing in the rarefied atmosphere. Raspy means grating, harsh. For example, the sergeant's raspy voice grated on the recruit's ears. Ratify means approve formally, confirm, verify. For example, party leaders doubted that they had enough votes in both houses of Congress to ratify the constitutional amendment. Ratiocination means reasoning, act of drawing conclusions from premises. For example, while Watson was a man of average intelligence, Holmes was a genius, whose gift for ratiocination made him a superb detective. Rationale means fundamental reason or justification. For example, her need to have someplace to hang her earring collection was Dora's rationale for piercing 15 holes in each ear. Rationalize means give a plausible reason for an action in place of a true. For example, when David told Gabby Gabrielle he couldn't give her a ride to the dance because he had no room in the car, he was rationalizing. Actually, he couldn't stand being cooped up in a car with anyone who talked as much as she did. Raucous means harsh and shrill, disorderly and boisterous. For example, the raucous crowd of New Year's Eve revelers got progressively noisier as midnight drew near. Rave means overwhelmingly favorable review. For example, though critic John Simons seldom has a good word to say about most contemporary plays, his review of All in the Timing was a total rave. Ravel means fall apart into tangles, unravel or untwist. For example, a single thread pulled loose, and the entire scarf started to ravel. Ravenous means extremely hungry. For example, the ravenous dog upset several garbage pails in its search for food. Raze means destroy completely. For example, spelling is important. To raise a building is to put it up. To raise a building is to tear it down. Reactionary means recoiling from progress. For example, opposing the use of English in worship services, reactionary forces in the church fought to reinstate the Mass in Latin. Realm means kingdom, field or sphere. For example, in the animal realm, the lion is the king of beasts. Reaper means one who harvests grain. For example, Death, the Grim Reaper, cuts down mortal men and women, just as a farmer cuts down the ripened grain. Rebuff means snub, beat back. For example, she rebuffed his invitations so smoothly that he did not realize he had been snubbed. Rebuke means scold harshly, criticize severely. For example, no matter how sharply Miss Watson rebuked Huck for his misconduct, he never talked back, but just stood there like a stump. Rebuttal means refutation, response with contrary evidence. For example, the defense lawyer confidently listened to the prosecutor sum up his case, sure that she could answer his arguments in her rebuttal. Recalcitrant means obstinately stubborn, determined to resist authority. For example, which animal do you think is more recalcitrant, a pig or a mule? Recant means disclaim or disavow, retract a previous statement. For example, those who can keep true to their faith, those who can't, recant. Recapitulate means summarize. For example, let us recapitulate what has been said thus far before going ahead. Recast means reconstruct. For example, let me recast this sentence in terms your feeble brain can grasp. In words of one syllable, you are a fool. Receptive means quick or willing to receive ideas, suggestions. For example, adventure-loving Huck Finn proved a receptive audience for Tom's tales of buried treasure and piracy. Recession means withdrawal, retreat, time of low economic activity. For example, the slow recession of the floodwaters created problems for the crews working to restore power to the area. Recidivism means habitual return to crime. For example, prison reformers in the United States are disturbed by the high rate of recidivism. The number of men serving second and third terms in prison indicates the failure of prisons to rehabilitate the inmates. Recipient means receiver. For example, although he had been the recipient of many favors, he was not grateful to his benefactor. Reciprocal means mutual, exchangeable, interacting. For example, the two nations signed a reciprocal trade agreement. Reciprocate means repay in kind. For example, if they attack us, we shall be compelled to reciprocate and bomb their territory. Recluse means loner. For example, disappointed in love, Miss Emily became a recluse. She shut herself away in her empty mansion and refused to see another living soul. Reconcile means correct inconsistencies, become friendly after a quarrel. For example, each month when we try to reconcile our checkbook with the bank statement, we quarrel. Reconnaissance means survey of enemy by soldiers. For example, if you encounter any enemy soldiers during your reconnaissance, capture them for questioning. Recount means narrate or tell, count over again. For example, a born storyteller, my father loved to recount anecdotes about his early years in New York. Recourse means resorting to help when in trouble. For example, the boy's only recourse was to appeal to his father for aid. Recrimination means countercharges. For example, loud and angry recriminations were her answer to his accusations. Rectify means set right, correct. For example, you had better send a check to rectify your account before American Express cancels your credit card. Rectitude means uprightness, moral virtue, correctness of judgment. For example, the Eagle Scout was a model of rectitude. Recumbent means reclining, lying down completely or in part. For example, the commanded ease does not permit you to take a recumbent position. Recuperate means recover. For example, the doctors were worried because the patient did not recuperate as rapidly as they had expected. Recurrent means occurring again and again. For example, Richard's recurrent asthma attacks disturbed us and we consulted a physician. Redolent means fragrant, odorous. For example, even though it is February, the air is redolent of spring. Redoubtable means formidable, causing fear. For example, during the Cold War period, neighboring countries tried not to offend the Russians because they could be redoubtable foes. Redress means remedy, compensation. For example, do you mean to tell me that I can get no redress for my injuries? Redundant means superfluous, repetitious, excessive G-wordy. For example, the bottle of wine I brought to Bob's was certainly redundant. How was I to know Bob owned a winery? In your essay, you repeat several points unnecessarily. Try to be less redundant in the future. Reek means emit odor. For example, the room reeked with stale tobacco smoke. Refraction means bending of a ray of light. For example, when you look at a stick inserted in water, it looks bent because of the refraction of the light by the water. Refractory means stubborn, unmanageable. For example, the refractory horse was eliminated from the race when he refused to obey the jockey. Refrain means abstain from, resist. For example, whenever he heard a song with a lively chorus, Sol could never refrain from joining in on the refrain. Refurbish means renovate, make bright by polishing. For example, the flood left a deposit of mud on everything. We had to refurbish our belongings. Refute means disprove. For example, the defense called several respectable witnesses who were able to refute the false testimony of the prosecution's sole witness. Regal means royal. For example, Prince Albert had a regal manner. Regale means entertain. For example, John regaled us with tales of his adventures in Africa. Regime means method or system of government. For example, when the French mention the old regime, they refer to the government existing before the revolution. Regimen means prescribed diet and habits. For example, I doubt whether the results warrant our living under such a strict regimen. Rehabilitate means restore to proper condition. For example, we must rehabilitate those whom we send to prison. Reimburse means repay. For example, let me know what you have spent and I will reimburse you. Reiterate means repeat. For example, he reiterated the warning to make sure everyone understood it. Rejoinder means comeback, reply. For example, when someone has been rude to me, I find it particularly satisfying to come up with a quick rejoinder. Rejuvenate means make young again. For example, the charlatan claimed that his elixir would rejuvenate the aged and weary. Relegate means banish to an inferior position, delegate, assign. For example, after Ralph dropped his second tray of drinks that week, the manager swiftly relegated him to a minor post cleaning up behind the bar. Relent means give in. For example, when her stern father would not relent and allow her to marry Robert. Relevant means pertinent, referring to the case in hand. For example, how relevant Virginia Woolf's essays are to women writers today. It's as if Woolf in the 1930s foresaw our current literary struggles. Relic means surviving remnant, memento. For example, Egypt's Department of Antiquities prohibits tourists from taking mummies and other ancient relics out of the country. Relinquish means give up something with reluctance, yield. For example, Denise never realized how hard it would be for her to relinquish her newborn son to the care of his adoptive parents. Relish means savor, enjoy. For example, watching Peter enthusiastically chow down, I thought, now there's a man who relishes a good dinner. Remediable means reparable. For example, let us be grateful that the damage is remediable. Remedial means curative, corrective. For example, because he was a slow reader, he decided to take a course in remedial reading. Reminiscence means recollection. For example, her reminiscences of her experiences are so fascinating that she ought to write a book. Remiss means negligent. For example, the guard was accused of being remiss in his duty when the prisoner escaped. Remission means cancellation of a debt, forgiveness or pardon. For example, though the senator had been treated for cancer, his symptoms were in remission, and he was considered fit enough to handle the strains of a presidential race. Remnant means remainder. For example, I suggest that you wait until the store places the remnants of these goods on sale. Remonstrance means protest, objection. For example, the authorities were deaf to the pastor's remonstrances about the lack of police protection in the area. Remorse means guilt, self-reproach. For example, the murderer felt no remorse for his crime. Remunerative means compensating, rewarding. For example, I find my new work so remunerative that I may not return to my previous employment. Rend means split, tear apart. For example, in his grief, he tried to rend his garments. Render means deliver, provide, represent. For example, he rendered aid to the needy and indigent. Rendition means translation, artistic interpretation of a song. For example, the audience cheered enthusiastically as she completed her rendition of the aria. Renegade means deserter, traitor. For example, because he had abandoned his post and joined forces with the Indians, his fellow officers considered the hero of Dances with Wolves a renegade. Renege means deny, go back on. For example, he reneged on paying off his debt. Renounce means abandon, disown, repudiate. For example, even though she knew she would be burned at the stake as a witch, Joan of Arc refused to renounce her belief that her voices came from God. Renovate means restore to good condition, renew. For example, they claim that they can renovate worn shoes so that they look like new ones. Renown means fame. For example, for many years an unheralded researcher, Barbara McClintock gained international renown when she won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. Rent means rip, split. For example, Kit did an excellent job of mending the rent in the lining of her coat. Reparable means capable of being repaired. For example, fortunately, the damages we suffered in the accident were reparable and our car looks brand new. Reparation means amends, compensation. For example, at the peace conference, the defeated country promised to pay reparations to the victors. Repast means meal, feast, banquet. For example, the caterers prepared a delicious repast for Fred and Judy's wedding day. Repeal means revoke, annul. For example, what would the effect on our society be if we decriminalized drug use by repealing the laws against the possession and sale of narcotics? Repel means drive away, disgust. For example, at first, the beast's ferocious appearance repelled Beauty, but she came to love the tender heart hidden behind that beastly exterior. Repellent means driving away, unattractive. For example, mosquitoes find the odor so repellent that they leave any spot where this liquid has been sprayed. Repercussion means rebound, reaction. For example, I am afraid that this unfortunate incident will have serious repercussions. Repertoire means list of works of music, drama. For example, the opera company decided to include Madame Butterfly in its repertoire for the following season. Replenish means fill up again. For example, before she could take another backpacking trip, Carla had to replenish her stock of freeze-dried foods. Replete means abundantly supplied. For example, the movie star's memoir was replete with juicy details about the love life of half of Hollywood. Replica means copy. For example, are you going to hang this replica of the Declaration of Independence in the classroom or in the auditorium? Replicate means reproduce, duplicate. For example, because he had always wanted a palace, Donald decided to replicate the Taj Mahal in miniature on his estate. Repository means storehouse. For example, libraries are repositories of the world's best thoughts. Reprehensible means deserving blame. For example, shocked by the viciousness of the bombing, politicians of every party uniformly condemned the terrorists' reprehensible deed. Repress means restrain, crush, oppress. For example, Anne's parents tried to curb her impetuosity without repressing her boundless high spirits. Reprieve means temporary stay. For example, during the 24-hour reprieve, the lawyers sought to make the stay of execution permanent. Reprimand means reprove severely, rebuke. For example, every time Ermengarde made a mistake in class, she was afraid that Miss Minchin would reprimand her and tell her father how badly she was doing in school. Reprisal means retaliation. For example, I am confident that we are ready for any reprisals the enemy may undertake. Reprise means repeat performance, recurrent action. For example, we enjoyed the soprano solo in Act I so much that we were delighted by its reprise in the finale. Reproach means express disapproval or disappointment. For example, he never could do anything wrong without imagining how the look on his mother's face would reproach him afterwards. Reprobate means devoid of a sense of decency. For example, I cannot understand why he has so many admirers if he is the reprobate you say he is. Reprove means censure, rebuke. For example, the principal severely reproved the students whenever they talked in the halls. Repudiate means disown, disavow. For example, on separating from Tony, Tina announced that she would repudiate all debts incurred by her soon-to-be ex-husband. Repugnant means hateful. For example, she found the snake repugnant and looked on it with loathing and fear. Repulsion means distaste, act of driving back. For example, hating bloodshed, she viewed war with repulsion. Reputable means respectable. For example, if you want to buy antiques, look for a reputable dealer. Far too many dealers today pass off fakes as genuine antiques. Reputed means supposed. For example, though he is the reputed father of the child, no one can be sure. Requiem means Mass for the dead. For example, they played Mozart's Requiem at the funeral. Requisite means necessary requirement. For example, many colleges state that a student must offer 3 years of a language as a requisite for admission. Requite means repay, revenge. For example, the wretch requited his benefactors by betraying them. Rescind means cancel. For example, because of the public outcry against the new taxes, the senator proposed a bill to rescind the unpopular financial measure. Resentment means bitterness, displeasure. For example, not wanting to appear a sore loser, Bill tried to hide his resentment of Barry's success. Reserve means self-control, formal but distant manner. For example, although some girls were attracted by Mark's air of reserve, Judy was put off by it, for she felt his aloofness indicated a lack of openness. Residue means remainder, balance. For example, in his will, he requested that after payment of debts, taxes, and funeral expenses, the residue be given to his wife. Resigned means accepting one's fate, unresisting. For example, resigned to his downtrodden existence, Bob Cratchit was too meek to protest Scrooge's bullying. Resilient means elastic, having the power of springing back. For example, highly resilient, steel makes excellent bed springs. Resolution means determination, resolve. For example, nothing could shake his resolution that his children would get the best education that money could buy. Resolve means determination, firmness of purpose. For example, how dare you question my resolve to take up skydiving? Of course, I haven't changed my mind. Resolve means decide, settle, solve. For example, Holmes resolved to travel to Bohemia to resolve the dispute between Irene Adler and the king. Resonant means echoing, resounding. For example, the deep, resonant voice of the actor James Earl Jones makes him particularly effective when he appears on stage. Respiration means breathing, exhalation. For example, the doctor found that the patient's years of smoking had adversely affected both his lung capacity and his rate of respiration. Respite means interval of relief, time for rest, delay in punishment. For example, after working non-stop on this project for 3 straight months, I need a respite. Resplendent means dazzling, glorious, brilliant. For example, while all the adults were commenting how glorious the emperor looked in his resplendent new clothes, one little boy was heard to say, "But he's naked." Responsiveness means state of reacting readily to appeals. For example, the audience cheered and applauded, delighting the performers by its responsiveness. Restitution means reparation, indemnification. For example, he offered to make restitution for the window broken by his son. Restive means restlessly impatient, obstinately resisting control. For example, waiting impatiently in line to see Santa Claus, even the best-behaved children grow restive and start to fidget. Restraint means moderation or self-control, controlling force. For example, control yourself. Young lady, show some restraint. Resumption means taking up again, recommencement. For example, during summer break, Don had not realized how much he missed university life. At the resumption of classes, however, he felt marked excitement and pleasure. Resurge means rise again, flow to and fro. For example, it was startling to see the spirit of nationalism resurge as the Soviet Union disintegrated into a loose federation of ethnic and national groups. Retain means keep, employ. For example, fighting to retain his seat in Congress, Senator Foghorn retained a new manager to head his re-election campaign. Retaliation means repayment in kind. For example, because everyone knew the Princeton band had stolen Brown's mascot, the whole Princeton student body expected some sort of retaliation from Brown. Retentive means holding, having a good memory. For example, the pupil did not need to spend much time studying, for he had a retentive mind and remembered all he read. Reticence means reserve, uncommunicativeness. For example, fearing his competitors might get advance word about his plans from talkative staff members, Hughes preferred reticence from his employees to loquacity. Retinue means following, attendance. For example, the queen's retinue followed her down the aisle. Retiring means modest, shy. For example, given Susan's retiring personality, no one expected her to take up public speaking. Surprisingly enough, she became a star of the school debate team. Retort means quick, sharp reply. For example, even when it was advisable for her to keep her mouth shut, she was always ready with a quick retort. Retract means withdraw, take back. For example, when I saw how Fred and his fraternity brothers had trashed the frat house, I decided to retract my offer to let them use our summer cottage for the weekend. Retrench means cut down, economize. For example, in order to be able to afford to send their children to college, they would have to retrench. Retribution means vengeance, compensation, punishment for offenses. For example, the evangelist maintained that an angry deity would exact retribution from the sinners. Retrieve means recover, find and bring in. For example, the dog was intelligent and quickly learned to retrieve the game killed by the hunter. Retroactive means of a law that dates back to a period before its enactment. For example, because the law was retroactive to the first of the year, we found she was eligible for the pension. Retrograde means go backwards, degenerate. For example, instead of advancing, our civilization seems to have retrograded in ethics and culture. Retrospective means looking back on the past. For example, the Museum of Graphic Arts is holding a retrospective showing of the paintings of Michael Whelan over the past 2 decades. Revelry means boisterous merrymaking. For example, New Year's Eve is a night of revelry. Reverent means respectful, worshipful. For example, though I bow my head in church and recite the prayers, sometimes I don't feel properly reverent. Reverie means daydream, musing. For example, he was awakened from his reverie by the teacher's question. Revert means relapse, backslide, turn back to. For example, most of the time Andy seemed sensitive and mature, but occasionally he would revert to his smart-alecky, macho, adolescent self. Revile means attack with abusive language. For example, though most of his contemporaries reviled Captain Kidd as a notorious, bloody-handed pirate, some of his fellow merchant captains believed him innocent of his alleged crimes. Revoke means cancel, retract. For example, repeat offenders who continue to drive under the influence of alcohol face having their driver's licenses permanently revoked. Revulsion means reaction. For example, many people in this country who admired dictatorships underwent a revulsion when they realized what Hitler and Mussolini were trying to do. Rhapsodize means to speak or write in an exaggeratedly enthusiastic manner. For example, she greatly enjoyed her Hawaiian vacation and rhapsodized about it for weeks. Rhetoric means art of effective communication, insincere language. For example, all writers, by necessity, must be skilled in rhetoric. Rhetorical. Means, pertaining to effective communication. For example, to win his audience, the speaker used every rhetorical trick in the book. Ribald. Means, wanton, profane. For example, he sang a ribald song that offended many of the more. Riddle. Means, pierce with holes. For example, with his machine gun, Tracy riddled the car with bullets till it looked like a slice of Swiss cheese. Rider. Means, amendment or clause added to a legislative bill. For example, Senator Foghorn said he would support Senator Filibuster's tax reform bill only if Filibuster agreed to add an anti-pollution rider to the bill. Rife. Means, abundant, current. For example, in the face of the many rumors of scandal, which are rife at the moment, it is best to remain silent. Rift. Means, opening, break. For example, the plane was lost in the stormy sky until the pilot saw the city through a rift in the clouds. Rig. Means, fix or manipulate. For example, the ward boss was able to rig the election by bribing people to stuff the ballot boxes with ballots marked in his candidate's favor. Rigid. Means, stiff and unyielding, strict, hard and unbending. For example, by living with a man to whom she was not married, George Eliot broke Victorian society's most rigid rule of respectable behavior. Rigor. Means, severity. For example, many settlers could not stand the rigors of the New England winters. Rigorous. Means, severe, harsh. For example, disliked by his superiors, the officer candidate in An Officer and a Gentleman endured an extremely rigorous training program. Rile. Means, irritate, muddy. For example, Red had a hair-trigger temper. He was an easy man to rile. Riveting. Means, absorbing, engrossing. For example, the reviewer described Bayat's novel Possession as a riveting tale, one so absorbing that he had finished it in a single night. Rivulet. Means, small stream. For example, as the rains continued, the small trickle of water running down the hillside grew into a rivulet that threatened to wash away a portion of the slope. Robust. Means, vigorous, strong. For example, after pumping iron and taking karate for 6 months, the little old lady was so robust that she could break a plank with her fist. Royal. Means, to make liquids murky by stirring up sediment. For example, be careful when you pour not to roil the wine. If you stir up the sediment, you'll destroy the flavor. Roster. Means, list. For example, they print the roster of players in the season's program. Rostrum. Means, platform for speech-making. For example, the crowd murmured angrily and indicated that they did not care to listen to the speaker who was approaching the rostrum. Rote. Means, repetition. For example, he recited the passage by rote and gave no indication he understood what he was saying. Rotundity. Means, roundness. For example, Washington Irving emphasized the rotundity of the governor by describing his height and circumference. Rousing. Means, lively, stirring. For example, and now, let's have a rousing welcome for TV's own Roseanne Barr, who'll lead us in a rousing rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner. Rout means stampede, drive out. For example, the reinforcements were able to rout the enemy. Rubble means broken fragments. For example, 10 years after World War II, some of the rubble left by enemy bombings could still be seen. Ruddy means reddish, healthy looking. For example, Santa Claus's ruddy cheeks nicely complement Rudolph the reindeer's bright red nose. Rudimentary means not developed, elementary, crude. For example, although my grandmother's English vocabulary was limited to a few rudimentary phrases, she always could make herself understood. Rue means regret, lament, mourn. For example, Tina rued the night she met Tony and wondered how she ever fell for such a jerk. Ruffian means bully, scoundrel. For example, the ruffians threw stones at the police. Ruminate means chew over and over, ponder. For example, unable to digest quickly the baffling events of the day, Reuben ruminated about them till 4 in the morning. Rummage means ransack, thoroughly search. For example, when we rummaged through the trunks in the attic, we found many souvenirs of our childhood days. Ruse means trick. For example, you will not be able to fool your friends with such an obvious ruse. Rustic means pertaining to country people. For example, the backwoods man looked out of place in his rustic attire. Ruthless means pitiless, cruel. For example, Captain Hook was a dangerous, ruthless villain who would stop at nothing to destroy Peter Pan. End of the word list with words starting with letter R.